Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining this COP26 clean transportation discussion. My name is Justin Bishop, and I'm happy to chair the session this afternoon. And I have 6 panelists with me today, and we'll be challenging the notion that we know where we want to be, we know where we are, but the challenge is really now to determine how quickly we can close that gap. And so I'll ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves, stating who they are, where they work, what they do, and answering the question about how we can move fast enough to close this gap in time to achieve net zero by 2050. Jameel, would you like to go first?
Can you hear me now, okay?
Yes.
Okay. Good afternoon, my name is Jameel, and I lead the policy and evaluation team within transport planning at AECOM, which is an infrastructure consulting firm. I've been involved in socio-economic and environmental appraisal and evaluation for over 20 years, primarily in the transport sector. When I started 20 years ago, one of my first projects was examining the case for the electrification of rail rolling stock compared to other options. I think if I was to look through business cases being developed today, the same arguments are being had and the same issues being rehearsed. More recently, I've provided advice to local authorities delivering business cases for the government's joint air quality unit in order to meet legally binding air quality targets, assessing the financial case to switch company car schemes to electric vehicles and install workplace charging infrastructure, examining the role of behaviour change and technology in changing how, where and why we travel and its impacts, and looking at the environmental and health benefits of the move to more active forms of travel. A key interest now is how we incorporate environmental appraisal into assessing the impact of transport investment and how this might lead to different and quicker outcomes to decisions that we've made in the last 2 decades. And I think that comes back to, are we moving fast enough? Sustainability, I do believe, may mean different things to different people, governments, institutions and businesses. So a little bit of care is needed there in terms of how different people and institutions interpret sustainability. I think in that sense, it's essential within the context of climate change that we understand the outcomes we're trying to achieve and by when. So in that sense, it becomes critical to define outcomes and targets, for example, net zero by 2050, rather than worrying about the broader argument as to should we be achieving that, who benefits, who disbenefits. I think when you have clear outcomes and targets, it's easier to work out scenarios to try and get to that point. Backcasting or visioning, I think sometimes referred to. Given the criticality of making changes now, it's clear, I believe, the progress has been slow. And I think the arguments for making changes rather sooner rather than later are actually quite well rehearsed. I think the technology, as Justin has mentioned, these are fairly well rehearsed. We understand what options we have, but in many senses, things haven't changed much or fast enough in the last 2 decades. What potentially has changed is that we're now starting to plan for mitigating impacts as well as avoiding them, which to me is the surest sign yet that we are actually moving quickly enough. And I looked through a presentation I delivered 10, 15 years ago, and the arguments I made then, I could make them today, which again, to me, seems to be an indication we really aren't moving fast enough. And actually, that starts changing the goalposts in terms of what we need to do and achieve. Thank you. So I might take more than 2 minutes there. Thank you.
No problem. Thanks very much. Natalie, would you like to go next?
Hi. I'm Natalie Rees, and I'm the Sustainable Development Manager at Transport for Wales. And my role is to embed sustainable development into the work that we're doing here, which involves rail, active travel, electric vehicle charging, bus, and getting broader all the time for our remit. In line with our duties under the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act here in Wales, we are delivering sustainable development as core to our operations. I also manage the climate change and ecology teams, as well as a heritage team in Transport for Wales. So my interest in improving public transport is in improving public transport and active travel, because I believe effective active travel and public transport can encourage people out of their cars and provide a cost-effective way to tackle a number of our key issues, including things like obesity, climate change, air quality, and even issues such as isolation and loneliness. Rapid growth in car use has been the fastest growing source of carbon emissions, and whilst all sectors need to decarbonise, I believe that reducing car use offers the least pain and most gain solution. So the main barriers I see to delivering more effective public transport and active travel at a national level really is inertia and a lack of investment in effective behavioural change campaigns. I think it's time now that we really start seriously talking to people about the huge impacts that travel causes in terms of carbon emissions, and the solutions that are, there ready to implement.
Great, thanks very much, Natalie. Craig, would you like to go next?
Sorry, I was just trying to find the unmute button there. Sorry. So hello everyone, my name's Craig Love and I'm a Climate Change and Sustainability Manager within Transport Scotland, who are the National Transport Agency, funnily enough, for Scotland. And we are an agency of the Scottish Government. My background is in carbon management and climate change, and the team that I manage within Transport Scotland lead on corporate climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, the circular economy, noise and flooding. The interest I have personally around clean transport is mainly around two issues. The first being from a corporate level and how we manage behavioural change within our own agency, and then secondly at a national level, as transport emissions are currently the highest emitter of emissions in Scotland. On the challenge of not moving fast enough for a sustainable future in terms of clean transport, in my opinion, it comes down to two key areas, which are limiting the changes which we need to see, and that is time and cost. Cost on its own could ultimately be a discussion in its own right. However, if we look at it in simple terms to the general public, say the expense of purchasing an electric car over a fossil fueled equivalent, it's actually really quite stark. So you couple that with individuals, families, businesses, corporations who have all been hit hard over the last couple of years, whether it's the rate of inflation or COVID, amongst other things. Making a large investment in times of uncertainty is also going to be a challenge. The second part to that is so closely aligned, and that's time. So you could almost align time and cost as equals, because from the public's decision making, in simple terms, again, you look at a train journey, say from Glasgow to London, it's more than 5 hours, whereas in a plane it's 50 minutes. So someone who's looking to travel for the family or the business, they're looking for the quickest option, and then you couple that with the cost that's associated with that, and it's cheaper to fly. So while we could maybe look at making flights more expensive, that's when the time's going to come back into it, because people want to get to where they need to be quicker. So the challenge and I think that we're going to see is that we've set targets, we know where we need to get there, but the public, for them, it comes down to that time and money.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks very much. Emmanuel, would you like to go next?
Thank you very much for that. My name is Emmanuel Ogbonna, and I work for HS2 as an environment manager. Part of my work is to work with our consultants, contractors, to make sure that we are reducing our carbon footprint. One of the things that we have set out to do is to look at our carbon life cycle, emission, to reduce that by 50% of whatever that we do. And that is one of our strategic goals, to build one of the most sustainable railways in the whole world. And that comes with a huge responsibility on our side to make sure that we keep to our words. But that's one of the, I have engineering background in the area of energy, sustainable energy technologies. And so I'm looking at how we can use that renewable energy within HS2. But my views today will be purely on mine. It's not HS2's views. I just try to put that caveat, right? Right. So that is where I am in the sustainable energy, in sustainability and climate change area, which I also do in HS2. But to answer the question, which is the challenge is not that we do not know what sustainable future looks like, but that we are not moving fast enough to get there in time. I would say that we are not doing that. We would want to, the way we are carrying on now is a knee-jerk response to what is happening to us. And I'll give you this example. If I was not privileged to listen to a discussion by the Minister of Road Transport and in charge of road transport and the coordinator of charging, EV charging, a week ago, I would have been given a different opinion. But now that I listen to the people who are right in the forefront, I know that we still have a long way to go in terms of infrastructure. It's a huge problem. Charging infrastructure is a huge problem. And also the coordination, government coordination. We are looking at coordination of the different transport sector is a huge issue, because when we're looking at clean transport, we should be talking about air transport, road transport, sea, and it looks like these things are not coordinated as looking at it from a holistic point of view. Yes, we know what we can do to get there, but our movement is slow in terms of, I look at the statistics, that by 2030, when we will ban every new vehicle, that ICE, which is an internal combustion engine vehicle, from getting into UK, at the moment, we are using about 2.3 new cars every year. So when you put that in perspective, that by 2030, that or more of the vehicles that will be registered in the UK will be EVs, electric vehicles. What infrastructure have we got in terms of charging? How do we, the cost, not even to talk about the cost of these vehicles, is it really realistic? That is the point. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Emmanuel. Tom, would you like to go next?
Hi there, everyone. This is Tom Reid. I work for the Department for Transport, and specifically in the low carbon fuels team, where we run a scheme called the Renewable Transport Fuels Obligation Order. One of the successes of that scheme is that nobody's ever heard of it, because basically what it does is ensure that when people buy petrol and diesel, a proportion of that petrol and diesel has come from renewable fuels. I'm the technical manager of the scheme, and I basically check any new fuel that someone wants to produce that's made from renewable materials, and make sure it meets our scheme's requirements. I've worked there for maybe 10 years now, a bit more. Seen an enormous amount of change in the industry. So I specifically work with the established fossil fuel industry more than anyone else. There's been a huge change in that 10 years in terms of their attitude to decarbonisation. So going to the assertion that we know what the future looks like, but we're not getting there quickly enough, as it were. I think you have to understand that a lot of these organisations are very slow moving. They're very risk averse. They've historically made enormous investments in infrastructure and things like refineries. And they don't want to rush into replacing them with anything else. So much as personally I'd like things to be going much more quickly than they are, I think realistically they will never go more quickly than they are. That's all from me for the intro.
Okay, thank you very, very much, Tom. Okay, and lastly, Rohit.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rohit Sharma. I used to work in the London office with ACOM. I recently moved to Perth, Australia, so it's a bit midnight for me, but it's good speaking and attending this call. I work at ACOM and I do infrastructure, economic appraisal and advisory work, business cases, and I am also a contributing author for the IPCC. We are at the moment writing the new report, and it should be published in a year or two, I think. And I work on the transport chapter on it. And I also work at the University of Cambridge in public health and transport to understand the impacts of active travel, specifically on public health. So my interest in clean transport is wide ranging in terms of my involvement with those 3 different organizations. And I think why we are not reaching that fast enough, I think it's coming back, if I see at the IPCC level, back in the day during Kyoto Protocol, we had legally binding emission targets for the countries. Then with the Paris Agreement, it's now voluntary. So perhaps it can be tried to be legally binding targets for emissions like we have for air quality. So every city might need to do something about it. Also, I picked up about the point, individual responsibilities. I think that shift is going towards more organizational or government departments' responsibilities rather than individual and as a collective local responsibilities. I think that can make more headways. But yeah, we are not moving fast enough for sure.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you everyone for those introductions. I want to move on to offering you an opportunity to give some sort of opening remarks to build upon that. But for the benefit of the audience, oftentimes we can break down the generation of emissions from transport into broadly, vehicle technology and fuels and demand for transport, if we think of those as individual levers. And a lot of times we start off with the technology end and fuels, and we sort of leave demand off to the side. So when you're framing your opening remarks, I invite you to look at demand first. And of course, the challenge is, how do we meet our demand for mobility whilst reducing the need to do it using motorized modes, ultimately? And then I'd like you to also discuss a little bit about what you see as the options in the shipping and the aviation sectors. We've touched on that a little bit during your introductions, because those are the hard to abate sectors. Even though they're small relative to road transport, they're also the ones that are showing the most growth. Those are the ones that are in lately times getting a lot more attention. And so it'd be nice to hear about that as well. But I wanted to start off with by putting a little bit of context. So the International Energy Agency released their sort of 2021 forecast for CO2 emissions, all sectors, all economies. And they show that emissions in 2020 dropped 6% from 2019 levels to 31.5 gigatons. And when we think of the extent to which COVID has disrupted the way that we view what we do, and everything about how we live and work and interact with others, to think that emissions have only dropped 6% it puts things into perspective. You imagine that, if we were having this conversation in 2030 and we looked back to 2010 on that graph, that time series graph, COVID could be a blip, and which is a sobering thought, because in many ways there was a discussion that COVID might put us onto a low carbon trajectory, might be the paradigm shift that we've all needed to kind of get the whole world to shift to a new path. But 6% is almost lost in the rounding error. And in fact, the IEA's, their sustainability development scenario suggests that, and that's in a sense their green scenario in some senses, suggests that in 2030, emissions from transport could be around 7.5 gigatons. Now that's about the same that we had in 2014. So nowhere near what the ingredients for achieving net zero or supporting sort of the wider economy decarbonization. And in the context of the UK, government, of course, as you know, has come out and said that the sale of new petrol and diesel cars will come to an end in 2030. Right now, new specifically electric cars are about 0.6% of the fleet. So we're starting off from a very low baseline. And even when we have a policy sort of position as strong as that in 9 years, there's a lot of work to do. Emmanuel, you mentioned the charging infrastructure. And so I would say the last point, just to sort of put the next couple sections into context, is that when we look back at petroleum use again in the UK, it's been largely stable over the last, I would say, not quite 10 years. And that's arguably with more people traveling, more activity, improvements in the conversion efficiency of vehicles. But ultimately, from an atmospheric point of view, from the environment, the emissions haven't changed. So yes, we're moving people, we're moving goods using less energy per kilometer or per ton kilometer, but actually we haven't turned that curve down sufficiently to get to where we need to in the next 30 years. So with that in mind, I invite you to, perhaps in the same order as we did just now, think a little bit about, and Tom, you said it quite rightly. There's a lot of inertia in the system. It's slow to move. That was in the context of fossil fuel companies, but I'm sure we could talk about it at the governmental level and the sub-governmental level. How do we face that challenge? And if you wouldn't mind starting from the perspective of demand for motorized transport. Jameel.
Thank you, Justin. So if I answer that correctly, we want to focus on the demand side. I mean, I suppose my focus tends to be on both demand and supply. They go hand in hand. If you provide the infrastructure, people will generally use it. It's the predict and provide scenario. If we build more roads, they will generally fill up. And I think if you're going to break that, you do need to have a look at the amount of supply we're catering for and the fact that we keep building for peak conditions, and we could be implementing policies that try and spread out that demand. But also from the demand perspective, focus on people traveling. I'd almost go back to why do people travel? What's the reason for that travel? We build infrastructure, we supply people with the ability to travel, to get to work, to go on business trips, or for leisure and education. And effectively we're catering towards accessibility needs. But we're embedding in the need to use existing modes of transport. A lot of journeys are local, and people are driving fairly short journeys. And we've got to question, what is the need to use single occupancy cars for that? Another issue, again, it comes back to this issue about supply and demand. For our medium to longer distance trips, when we look at the case for investment infrastructure, we tend to do business cases. And we have the concept of value of time. So we are building infrastructure because the business case shows that having a small journey time saving for many, many people makes it worthwhile to do. So the economic case stacks up. Small little changes for what are considered high value business trips, for example, can actually make the case for a scheme. Whereas larger changes for shorter distance trips might not make the case. And if you look at the case for public transport and investment in public transport, those are often short to medium journeys in cities, for example, in city centres. When you look at the case for active travel, those are often in areas where you're trying to gear up towards existing uses where people are actually driving. So you're effectively trying to take away some capacity of road space sometimes. And that comes with a disbenefit. And if you're looking at a rounded, well-developed business case, you have to take that into account. Then you've got a bit of your policy puzzle missing, which is how do we encourage people to switch to active travel? And shouldn't one of our goals be to encourage people to travel differently or at different times or not at all? You see, if you have a policy goal that says we want people to use low emission vehicles or to cycle more or to meet a certain climate change or air quality target, if you have that objective and it is a core part of what you're trying to achieve, your business case falls apart if you don't hit that objective. If it's just one of many objectives, and the economic case, the value of time is all part of that, you can end up actually in a situation where you are just doing more of the same. I'm not saying doing more of the same is wrong, if that's what the business case is showing, but it doesn't seem to actually tally with the climate change objectives that we've set ourselves. It doesn't necessarily tally with the air quality objectives that we've set ourselves. And also, I'm not sure that we are still as good as we think we are on really assessing the longer term and wider impacts of health. I know we changed our discounting on health impacts. I think it was a couple of years ago, 2-3 years ago. The way that we value the impact on someone's health was always discounted in the same way as any other benefit or disbenefit. It was a few years ago that we changed it. The way we discount the impact on the environment is discounted in the same way it is on everything else. So if you develop a business case that looks at investment, that's why I'm focusing a bit more on supply and demand side, but I think there are other very well qualified people here to talk about demand. If you look at the impact on supply, we will continue doing what we have done. The other point is, if we were to make a change that somehow prioritised lower carbon development in, say, public transport, you still have the issue of embodied carbon to build new infrastructure. If you want to build new rail lines and new mass rapid transit, you have embodied carbon. So yes, you have a longer term benefit, but that longer term benefit might be outweighed on the basis of the assumption that everyone's going to switch to low emission vehicles. So we've now got ourselves into a little bit of a problem here, which is, if we really do think everyone's going to switch to electric vehicles in 10 years, why should we start investing in more public transport now, such as mass rapid transit or rail? Because that will take 10 years to get off the ground, and by which time we think everyone will have switched to cleaner vehicles. Well, that actually makes the argument stronger to invest in the sort of the lower cost, quick wins, such as bus, maybe tram, active travel. And as I said, a lot of journeys are relatively short, and there is the option to switch to alternative modes. And there is a very big health benefit associated with active travel. That still does not address the issue of longer distance travel or freight. A lot of business travel is freight. That is not going to go away, and there you are starting to look at technology or whether or not waterways or shipping or aviation versus rail become comparable. And I think there's a separate argument to be had as to how we deal with the massive amounts of goods that we are shipping around the country or shipping around the world. I think technology is ultimately going to be the main way to solve some of those options. I don't think, behaviour change, all that work, people will still order online. People will still expect home deliveries. You could increase the cost or provide a carbon charge on some of that, but it's still going to happen. So you need the technology behind to make it sustainable. And I don't think there's an easy solution around HGVs, aviation, shipping. I think you are looking at technology and incentivising and potentially subsidising some technology options. And I think finally, sorry if I'm not talking for too long, I think picking up on I think it was Tom's point about how industry is quite slow moving. I think that's a fair point. The infrastructure is there and it's being used. And it's not going to be a quick change. There's massive amounts of cost to actually making changes. And we're getting to the point where we can switch to lower carbon alternatives, but that requires investment and infrastructure in and of itself. Switching people to public transport, if it's rail or mass rapid transit, has a cost. If you switch people to bus, possibly tram and active modes, I think those are the quick wins. And given the need to move quickly, I am sometimes surprised that we aren't doing more to try and encourage people to use alternative modes. And I hate to say it, but this is the transport economist in me. Pricing, the right pricing has to be there. Public transport or switching to alternative modes is too expensive. People won't do it.
Thank you, Jameel. It's and in a sense that ties in with Craig, your point that the time and cost bit and the discounting rates and the way that we appraise transport and how we value certain key elements that may have been, well, they would have been, I guess value is a judgment, it's a social position, and that has evolved, but perhaps the ways that we measure the impacts of transport haven't evolved in the same way. And, Natalie, moving on to you, Jameel raised the idea of, no regret decisions, right? And there's the whole point of how do you and I am asking you because of your role as sustainable development manager, and then on to Craig as well. How do you want to move at pace, but you don't want to create problems elsewhere while pursuing a narrow decarbonization agenda, right? Along with all the other things that we've been discussing. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts on how we bring those things together.
Yeah, I think I have sort of similar things to say, but in terms of that sort of stopping problems from getting worse, I suppose, in Wales, I've mentioned we have this piece of legislation called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. It has 5 ways of working, and one of those ways of working is prevention, taking a preventative approach. And that's embedded into the way that public sectors work in Wales. And I think that's really important because it makes you look across a number of key areas where we have always in the past taken an approach to put a sticking plaster on the mistakes that we have made. So I hope that that legislation, which is being now adopted by other organisations outside the public sector, will really enable us to deliver much more considered ideas. And then I suppose in terms of my response, so we know road transport contributes a third of UK emissions, and we have made this commitment under the Paris Agreement to limit global warming. In Wales, we've suspended all future road building plans. And the government are reviewing proposed schemes, and the money that would be saved by not building roads can then be used to improve existing roads. And the creation of new bus and cycle lanes and infrastructure for more sustainable travel. And we know that in order to hit our 2050 target, 60% of journeys need to be made sustainably. Which is a huge amount by the date that we're aiming to reach net zero. And the suspended road building plans are not about never building roads again. There'll still be access required for new housing schemes, for example, or schemes to improve air quality in areas where air quality needs to be improved. But we do need more investment in clean public transport, making trains cleaner, more affordable and more efficient, and probably integrating the public and active travel network so that people find it more convenient than driving. I really think integration is really important. Jameel mentioned, that even new public transport investment involves carbon, but I think there's more opportunity now to look at net zero construction projects, and that's certainly what we're doing in terms of our electrification of the railway. We need to build more infrastructure for active travellers and make it easier for people to get about without their cars. Home working, online shopping, video conferencing, reduced trip rates, particularly over the last 18 months. Obviously, they haven't made fundamental changes, as you were mentioning earlier. But there's definitely a role for the creation of sort of complete and compacted 20-minute neighbourhoods where people can meet their everyday needs within a short walk or cycle, because this produces those multiple benefits I mentioned earlier, boosting the local economy, improving health and well-being, increasing social connections, and tackling climate change too. And I think though there is a role for the investment in the EV charging network, I don't think we should see this as a replacement for vehicles. It's just replacing a vehicle with another vehicle, and it still contributes to congestion. And there's that issue around embodied carbon. So if we're serious about returning to a green economy, I think we need to see more investment in sustainable transport, electrification of the railway, looking at alternative fuels like hydrogen where viable, and better battery technology as well. And I think that's it from me.
Okay, great, thanks, Natalie. Certainly one thing that popped up partly from what Jameel was saying and what you just said is, there's the notion of, the walkable city, the 15-minute city, the 20-minute city, and the integration of land use and transport planning. And I'm glad that we're going to go to Craig now, because one of the things I want to ask, as you're the Scotland's equivalent to Natalie, what's the role of transport authorities, national transport authorities like yours, to be able to help to create that? Because in a sense, as I say, partly this is a discussion about the UK, but the UK is hosting COP, and there are going to be other countries that don't have necessarily the wealth of information expertise that we do, right? So how do we show through Transport Scotland, Transport Wales, and others, how we can do this?
I think the difficulty you've got for governments across the UK is that we're very good at setting targets. So the targets, we can all set a target, and I think that's something we're very, very good at doing. You look post-lockdown, and we're obviously seeing travel levels return to what you would say somewhat normal, although it's not anywhere near as busy as it previously was. But consistently across the world, travel and travel demand is expected to grow, as you said. So while we're implementing plans and policies with targets and dates, I think personally a lot of the gaps lie within how we actually get there. So what does a reduction in car kilometres actually mean for Joe Public? What will the requirements of a phased out fossil fuel transport actually be for the people who use it? I think that when we set targets, although it is essential for a starting point, I'm not sure that perhaps a lot of people know what it actually means for them. I think on the wider issue or subject of switching people to alternative modes, as it's not only expensive, but the embodied carbon that was mentioned, that's going to become a much bigger issue as well. If we're building new infrastructure or upgrading existing infrastructure, that has embodied carbon. But then we're not even thinking about the vehicles that we need to use, which are carbon intensive. And then we have all the vehicles that we need to dispose of because they can no longer be used, carbon intensives. Then in Scotland, again, we're looking at 20-minute neighbourhoods. I think it's a really good idea. I think that's a way forward for everybody. The infrastructure involved in making that possible is carbon intensive. So while we're saying we're moving towards a low carbon economy and a low carbon shift in what we need to do day to day, actually it's quite carbon intensive to get there. So yes, we might see reductions coming from people shifting their modes, but what about all the carbon that's associated elsewhere? So yes, transport's going down, but that might mean that industry is going up. I think from a government point of view, I think education is key for us to be able to get buy-in from the public. And that comes back to that idea of them not really knowing what it means for them. If we can embed climate literacy and carbon literacy into people's everyday psyches and the way that they think about how they go about their business, then you're more likely to get buy-in. And I think the biggest problem that we haven't seen that we will probably face with all of this is that we will all change our habits as we will have to. But then it becomes the discussion, well, we're still seeing climate change. We're still impacted by climate change. Weather's getting worse. So a lot of people are then going to turn around and question, well, why have we made all these changes? And I think that again comes back to climate literacy and that it's not important for us, these changes. It's for the future generations. That's why we need to do this.
Thanks, Craig. Agreed. And in a sense, part of the reason why I mentioned, the bit about the electric vehicles and so on is that, in a sense, we a lot of new technology has come on in the last few years worldwide. Yet, our petroleum consumption is pretty much level. And you kind of think, well, how much harder do we have to work to turn that down? And to say to somebody, at an individual level, you have to do as much as you can all the time. That's in and of itself not sustainable. But we've talked about embodied carbon, and new infrastructure or replacing old infrastructure, which is a nice segue onto Emmanuel, who's in charge of HS2 or HS2 sustainability, and that as a brand new infrastructure project. And interested to hear then, Emmanuel, how based on your experience, how big new infrastructure, whether it be train terminals, coach stations, airports, seaports, how do they manage the embodied carbon, recognizing that even if they're running electric trains, there's still a lot of concrete being used, there's still a lot of other resources that are being required of nature. So yes, interested to hear your thoughts there.
Thank you very much, Justin. Yeah, it's a huge business on building new infrastructure. And one of the problems, as you highlighted, is the embodied carbon, which takes about 60% of the carbon, the life cycle assessment carbon of any infrastructure. And how do you get that right? I begin to say that it's during design that you actually reduce most of your carbon, not even in construction, because it depends on when you design. How do you design the infrastructure? What kind of facilities do you put in, in terms of sustainability standards? Those are the things that would reduce your embodied carbon. And just to be precise, a lot of work is going or behind the scene. A lot of experiments are going behind the scene that the public or even a lot of people working in HS2 are not aware of. Like we're looking at how reducing the emission of the plants that we use, the site electricity supplies, the kind of concrete that we use, the kind of steels that we use. So we are looking at a whole bunch of materials and mode of construction, method of construction. So we're looking at a whole lot of things that can contribute to carbon reduction. So it's not just one thing that we're looking at. So that is helping us. And one of the things that we do is we sit down with the contractors to say, how can we help? We collaborate. How can we help in terms of, because some of the things that they need to implement might be cost intensive, and we have to bear some of those costs, right? To ensure that we are hitting that carbon goal that we have set. So those are things, some of the initiatives that we have taken, not just to allow the contractors to manage it themselves. We work with them, we collaborate with them, to do that. Whether it be using renewables in terms of the sites. And of course, one of the energy intensive areas that we have today is the tunnel boring. And we are working with the contractor to ensure that we in terms of finance, we bear some of those costs to use renewable energy. So that's the area that we need to look at in terms of reducing the embodied carbon. Stepping out of that, looking at demand. Yes, there's demand in transport. Yes, you can reduce it because it says it helps people, no matter your social status. Transportation helps. But the thing is, public transport, when we look at it in this country, train, for example, is very expensive compared to you kicking your car. You look at the amount of petrol that you would use. And if you're paying from where I live in Peterborough to London, if I'm buying a train ticket off peak, it's about £30, £40, depending on the type of train. But if I use my car to London, it's cheaper in terms of I just go there, I've already paid for the car. So it's just the fuel to take me there. So when I'm making that decision, I'm thinking, how much am I going to pay? What kind of comfort am I going to get, right? To get to London and back and at my own term. I look at, okay, I use my car. It's cheaper. It's more comfortable for me to do that, to make that journey. So those are the things the public would consider. Not that, yes, you're telling me that it's more carbon efficient to travel into public transport. I get that in my head, but in my pocket, I don't see that. So when you compare that to the COVID that we had, the reason why it was a successful project was because government bore the cost. If you left that cost to be on the individuals and the private sector, I bet you that we will still be battling with COVID the same way it was in March, April 2020, because people will not be making that headway. So if we go down the line of stopping people from traveling and not giving them a good alternative to travel, it wouldn't help. people will just look at government as increasing taxes. And of course, part of the thing is that the confidence level of saying, okay, if you increase the charges on transportation, say flying, for example, you increase the charges on flying, people are going to look at it that it's another revenue avenue anyway. It's not that you're going to do anything to reduce emission. Take for example,
Tom, just building on what Emmanuel was saying. So I think we can, there's no cost intervention, right? You're going to be there are going to be implications for the environment and for wider society, even if the project that you're putting in place is in most contexts a good one. And it's difficult to compete with public transport if you put a car next to it. So I guess that comes back to the original bit about how can we make it so that you don't need a car in the first instance, right? Through the walkable cities and the active transport. So I guess the question to you, Tom, we have, spoke to Natalie and to Craig as transport authorities at the national level, but where what is the role of the traditional fuel suppliers, those who have provided all that we've needed up to this point, and who we're on some level depending on for the future?
So I mean, the traditional fuel suppliers don't want to go out of business, so they have started to adjust their business model about how they will decarbonize. And I think that's key as well, because we are totally dependent on them at the moment for particularly transport, but for many other things as well. Bear in mind that an oil refinery doesn't just make transport fuel, it makes things that are precursors for paint, plastics. When you think an electric car, what an electric car is actually made of, there's an enormous amount of plastic components in an electric car. So there is a future for oil refineries, but they're going to have to look at what they're using as in place of the crude oil. And there are refineries already doing this. They're taking in renewable materials instead of crude oil and processing those and making all the things that you would normally expect an oil refinery to make, but from renewable materials. Only doing it at small levels at the moment, but at the moment they're sort of testing the technology, making sure things work okay. Going back to one of the previous points that people were making, I mean, I think the government would never want to make things too expensive for individuals. If you put onerous taxes on air travel, it means that air travel is only there for the rich. That's not a politically acceptable message. You also have the issue that if you make things expensive, like air travel or driving, the people who can afford it then feel that their conscience is clear and they don't do it any less if they can afford it anyway. And they think, well, I've paid for it, so I'm going to do it. So that's another thing to consider when trying to introduce pricing into this model. Yet another thing to consider with pricing is that the UK is relatively far ahead in decarbonising in terms of the policies we've got in place. If you get too far ahead, though, all it does is shift industry to other countries. If you brought in more road charging, if you made fuel more expensive, it means haulage would get very expensive. It would mean British manufacturing businesses wouldn't be able to compete with people producing the same goods elsewhere where they didn't have such expensive travel requirements. Which is why we're going at the pace we're at, because ultimately we live in a democracy. The government can't just instigate new policies which basically make everyone's lives more expensive or in a perceived way less fun. Like, we don't want to tell people you can't go on holiday because flying is bad. That's not a politically acceptable message. So the future would be making, to some extent, aeroplanes more efficient, but also the work that's been done over the last 10 years by my team in introducing renewable fuels into the road transport market. We're now seeing a big shift into those fuels being further refined and made into aviation fuels. So in the future, hopefully, in fact, in the very near future, as of next month, you'll be able to pay a small premium to use renewable jet fuel in an aeroplane if you wanted to fly somewhere a bit more sustainably. Like I say, there's a tension there with the fact that means that adding price means it's putting the price up makes things more expensive, which makes it slightly more sort of exclusive. But the only way that aviation will ever decarbonize is to use renewable fuels in place of fossil fuels, and unfortunately they are more expensive as things currently stand.
Many thanks, Tom, much appreciated. And so onto you, Rohit. What Tom was just saying, there's this tension, right, between wanting to not shift the problem to places that are perhaps not as quick, not as far ahead as the UK is, but then also not making life difficult for everybody in the process. And so, and with your work, with the IPCC and the Fifth Assessment Report, I'm curious to hear, what are the governments integrated? When they think of this problem, are all elements of the government moving in the same direction, or are some doing things that are actually acting in opposition to the other side?
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole reason aviation shipping was not part of the Paris Agreement. So no one really wanted to take the responsibility in a way, and so that is a problem. And it took, I think, the Pope got involved in the end to get everyone on the table for the Paris Agreement, specifically the Southern American countries. So I think it was the biggest negotiation at the international level to get some agreement on Paris as part of the Paris Climate Agreement. But it's quite strong, because it's not about this climate change, reducing the emissions, but it is about the Sustainable Development Goals, all the 17. So it's also include the equity impacts of it. Some countries might be doing really well in one of the goals, but not as well in the others. And it is voluntary, so every country produces a report, and we can see that even very rich countries don't do well in a number of different goals. So I think that's why putting the perspective of Sustainable Development Goals is quite important, because we can put all the electric vehicles, but we're going to miss out on the health goals, which is coming through active travel, equity impacts. Perhaps not everyone can afford the electric vehicle. So there will be significant equity impacts. Also, incentivizing communities would be helpful. So making, like I think Craig was touching on the education part, educating and also incentivizing communities, making a bit of a competition within communities, organizations to do well in terms of the demand management. We have quite adapted in certain way with the COVID times to work from home, so there can be some demand management through it, including in addition to the pricing and stuff. At the community level, organization level, so not just one person does it, but kind of it's more like a local community push towards the local economy push. If people are walking, buying local stuff, it's different co-benefits, which comes from the Sustainable Development Goals. And on the aviation shipping, I think there's a more focus towards the how we can legally certify carbon offsets. So we understand that it won't, in near future, it won't be possible that the aviation and shipping industry will move towards renewable. The hydrogen, the ammonia cell fuels can be advanced enough. There are some coming out from, I think, Switzerland recently, but still quite expensive and won't be commercially adopted throughout the globe. So perhaps legally certified carbon offsets from the aviation and shipping industries, that can be a way to push them towards net zero. But of course, there will be some impact on the pricing. But something has to be done, because it's the freight cost. I think the freight is 15% of the global emissions, aviation and shipping total. And that will grow. Recently, Australia announced that they're going to open the borders, and everyone is booking flights. No, I know here, So it's going to come back and it's going to increase significantly much more. Everyone wants to go on a holiday and just go out and catch a plane.
What I want to do though, and thanks for the comments. I guess what I want to do in the time remaining is I guess pose to you, and Rohit, you mentioned the co-benefits, and we were talking about and particularly for Craig and Natalie, as in charge of, or minded about sustainable development and the wider goals of well-being and future generations and so on. And in the context of what Tom was saying, there's almost as though if the government are trying to thread a path between, as I say, not causing further problems, either abroad or at home, then it almost begs the question, well, can we actually achieve what we're setting out to do by 2050, right? Because clearly they're constrained on both sides. So then in that sense, whatever policies we're putting in place, you kind of think, okay, we know we're not potentially going to get to where we need to be on time. So how do we maximize the return for the policies that we are putting in place? So we maximize these co-benefits and so on. So I wanted to ask you, about, what are the types of no regrets decisions, you'd like to make or you'd like to see made? In the case of Natalie, have you found that the Health and Wellbeing and the Future Generations Act, has that been implemented well? Has it been, it's ambitious in statement, but has that translated into action? Or, likewise in Scotland, Craig, do you see similar things? And I guess to both Rohit and Jameel, how are you seeing sustainability, sustainable development, decarbonization? How is that coming through in the types of projects that you work in, coming in from the consulting side? So a more general discussion about that. We are constrained, we're in this sandwich. So how do we make the best of this situation?
I think if I can come in first, if that's okay.
Sure.
Yeah. So from my point of view, if we want to change behaviours, you have to start with the people who are going to live with those changes in the future. So if we want to move towards people having more access to active travel, then you make active travel easily accessible at a young age. One of the things we're trialing in Scotland is free. It's a pilot scheme for kids for them to get free bikes if their families can't afford them. So that's giving them the opportunity to actually access bikes and be able to use active travel when they haven't been able to previously. Personally, I think that's an exceptionally good scheme. But for me, I think that needs rolled out much wider. I think active travel, bikes, etc., if we want our children to start using them more frequently and often, give everybody a free bike. Bikes should be made free, and that's an easy one. Because if you think about the amount of money you might invest in a major infrastructure project or behavioural change schemes or whatever, if we actually have something available that someone can go along and get what they need at no expense, then you're going to see more uptake. And then as people get older and they're no longer part of the scheme, that's so embedded in their psyche. I think that's an example of something that's good, that could be rolled out very easily across the whole of the UK. It's also not only giving people who are maybe in low and middle income families the opportunity to access this travel, but give it to everyone. I just think it's a very easy one, and it fits with a whole myriad of sustainability policies and strategies and active travel strategies. I think it's certainly a way forward.
It's a good point, because in some senses, we're not. I think oftentimes we think of everybody taking the same mode of transport for all trip purposes at all times of day and all days of the week, which isn't the case, And so there's maybe the softly of chipping away at those trips that we might normally take by car and thinking, okay, well, how do we do something else? And I guess if when you're a youngster, if your default way of getting around is pedaling, then that becomes a new baseline, which is quite powerful.
Sorry, I was going to say, linking to that, I think it's the opportunity to give people a go at active travel as well. We've seen a real increase in the amount of sort of bike hire schemes, and in Wales recently they've started introducing e-bike hire schemes, and then you've got e-cargo bike schemes now where businesses can borrow an e-cargo bike to give that a go. And I think it's about getting people out on their bikes as well. We've got brilliant lady in Wales called Muna who runs a charity called Privilege Cafe, and she's a real champion for getting people out on their bikes. She rides a bike in a full traditional clothing, you know, her burqa, and you know, the Next bike setup, which has a covered back wheel, it means that her clothes don't get caught in the chains, you know, so that allows, you know, it's allowing more people to cycle, and we want to see that across, you know, all groups. And, you know, brilliant charities offering disabled bikes so that people can get out and just have a go at it. And we should be talking about our journeys as well. I commute 15 miles each way to my office once a week by electric bike. You know, but I talk about that. I talk about it to people. I share it on social media, you know, and that's how we get other people to give it a go.
Rohit, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I think in terms of projects, we have seen movement on local walking and cycling plans a lot. We have been doing a lot of local walking and cycling plans. There's a big movement in investments and active travel, making the temporary ones permanent, which were built during the COVID times. Also, there's a big push now to include active travel in the transport modeling, with the agent-based modeling coming up. Be at Cambridge are doing a project to include how active travel can be embedded in transport modeling, and also health modeling can be embedded in it, and including the built infrastructure impacts. So if the school's location changes, what would be the behavior of the people and how the modeling results will show, but that also leads to the health benefits of providing the evidence base and the funding of these researches coming through, which is brilliant. So we are seeing a lot of movement in terms of consulting and academics. And I think there's more acceptance from the policymakers. Natalie and Craig, we're working the government. The government is also accepting those funding schemes of approving those projects. It was much more in UK as compared to Australia. That is quite true. We don't have, in Australia, we don't have the health discounting factors. So that is a bit not progressive. We are not even part of the Paris Agreement yet. So I think UK is quite progressive in that way, especially in a couple of years. Jameel will have a more broader view.
Well, I was just going to ask Jameel, you know, in some senses, and we talked a bit about the economic case, right, and building broader business cases. And in some case, you know, you'd almost imagine that if you build a robust economic case for, you know, embodying health and, you know, the carbon benefits and climate resilience and mitigation, all the rest of it, then, you know, for a place like Australia or any other country that hasn't signed up to the Paris Agreement, a compelling business case is a compelling business case, you know, quite separate from the commitment. So I guess I'm wondering, you know, in your experience, what have you seen in terms of you know, boosting that, you know, to Craig to use your term, that literacy, but at the level of you know, project financiers or, you know, project sponsors, to understand these much wider impacts, which perhaps typically they would have said is outside of our scope, but obviously the projects have broader societal impact.
Yeah, and I suppose one of the issues is, if you look at the guidance, especially in the UK, it's actually relatively thorough. And this is possibly the worry, but it does cover a lot. It covers the traditional economic impacts and you know, what the traditional business cases, because you've got journey time savings, safety savings, reliability improvements. But we are meant to look at things like social and distribution impacts and who has, which segments of society are impacted the most or the least, and get a benefit or a disbenefit. We have the ability to assess air quality impacts. There will be arguments about whether or not the monetization of air quality or carbon is correct, because they're not particularly big impacts for the most part. Where it does have a change, where you don't make a legally binding target, then someone will force you to act because someone's decided there's a health impact associated with a certain level of air quality, and they can still do it. association if we're above a certain level. So you then force that change. Your objective is to at least meet that target. Well, you don't have that. I don't think air quality and health and carbon would generally be a big enough part of the economic case to make a change. Where it should feature is the strategic case for a scheme. So one of your objectives, or two, you have a set of objectives saying this is what we're trying to achieve. We want to have net zero, or we want to decrease carbon emissions compared to a do nothing scenario by 30%, whatever it is. And you come up with your options. And there are well-engineered ways, well-rehearsed ways to appraise those options, whether it's at a high level or getting down to actually, here's our shortlist, 2 or 3 options that we want to assess in more detail and come to a decision. And UK government guidance is actually quite well developed. It's actually quite mature. There's always scope for improvement. The issues will be, should we monetize and quantify everything? Or do we come to a decision which is, the objective is to get to net zero. The objective is that we want to meet this air quality target. So whether or not you have an option that's there or thereabouts is irrelevant. Do we meet it? Do we not? And you get rid of your options that are not meeting your core objectives. And I don't think we're there yet. And I think picking up what Tom said earlier about pricing people in or out, this is a global issue. It's only going to work if everyone is signed up to doing something like aviation. Yes, you're never going to introduce a price here that makes us uncompetitive with everyone else. I think there's a bigger issue in terms of whether pricing really needs a price increase. I think you've got to look at the positive benefits of things like active travel, public transport, the social impacts, the fact that it's accessible to more people are often looked at in enough detail. And those social distribution impacts, they are part of the assessment, but they're almost done at the end, just annexed to the appraisal of what we think good looks like. And if we're going to start making the argument that a price increase, I'm not a proponent of increasing prices, but price, people are sensitive to price because you can't afford something or something suddenly becomes more affordable, it will change your behaviour. That's one of those issues. If we are going to start making the argument that we shouldn't price people out of things, I completely understand that argument. But how often do we make that argument with everything else in society? How often does someone say we need to get rid of tax either? For example, clothes. I'm assuming children's clothes don't have VAT in them. But there's a whole array of parts of society, parts of the economy where we don't take into account the impact on different groups in any meaningful way. So why is transport different? There's a good reason for it to be different in terms of accessibility and access to opportunities, but those aren't the arguments people are making when they talk about the impact of price. But as I said, the price doesn't mean you increase the price of things you don't like. It can mean, at least in the short term, trying to make things more cost effective that wouldn't otherwise be. The issue about price was really helpful from Craig, because one of the issues I have with active travel is how many people can afford to get that bike in the first place? How many people have somewhere to store a bike safely and securely? I've lived in semi-detached or terrace homes for many years. It's not easy for me to keep a bike somewhere that's safe and secure, but I will use a bike that's rentable or easily available I can pick up, or I will get a small bike I can wheel in, like one of the little fold-up bikes, but they're expensive. And for the average person, that's not that accessible. E-scooters, electric scooters become another issue. There's a safety issue here, but in urban areas, 20 mile an hour limits, is that a big deal? If you start looking at bringing safety into urban design. I think we picked up on the issue with embodied carbon with integrated land use and transport planning. The one thing I'd say there is, in some cases, we know we have to build new homes, because the other issue with pricing is how often are we actually building affordable homes for people? But we know we have to build homes or renovate existing housing. Where we're doing that, there's going to be some form of embodied carbon. Make sure at that design stage you build in something that is low carbon, but has other benefits, whether it's health or community. You build in those facilities within 20, 30 minutes. All of that, I mean, these aren't new issues, I've got to say. All of these are relatively well known. It's the implementation. And I think the arguments I hear against them are no different to 20 years ago. And that's the worrying thing. We talk about the need for speed, but none of the arguments I'll hear for or against are probably any different to 20 years ago. I don't know if that's what you wanted to hear. But
No, I mean, I think that's true, and it means that a lot rides on each successive COP because the timelines have contracted. In a sense, we still have, like Craig, your free bicycle scheme, and you could even think and say, okay, well, actually, for the purposes of being able to store a bicycle, actually, if you went to, I think what Paris did with their bicycle scheme, where you got the first 30 minutes for free, actually, everybody doesn't have to have their own bicycle. They just have to have access to a bicycle. You know what I mean? And that deal, that there's, circular economy benefits there, notwithstanding when they, get damaged perhaps more quickly than if it was your own. But then there's the thought, and Jameel mentioned right at the end on embodied carbon. And Emmanuel, I remember what you were saying about for HS2, and you can think of it for other large infrastructure projects. There's a cost sharing approach. It's one thing to say that we collaborate with our contractors. It's another thing to say we split the costs on novel technologies and novel business practices. And I wonder, Emmanuel, if you can talk a bit more about where other ways that you can see us, particularly with the big energy using components of construction. How project sponsors and suppliers work better together to chip away at these emissions. Again, I think that we're probably coming to the point where we're not expecting to see a step change anytime soon because there's too much inertia in the system, but all we can do is really chip away as best we can.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think collaboration, like you said, with the contractors, the guys that are building it, and the owners of projects should be not just talking. It should include sharing costs to innovate, because the contractors, like I've seen and noticed, are willing to do that. They're willing to experiment. But when they look at the cost, that has become a drawback to say, can we do this? Yes, we know that we can, but we are there to make profit. Of course, that's what they are there to do. And if what the new technology or the innovation will cost them more than they have budgeted for, of course, that wouldn't go. So for project sponsors, the message is collaborate with them even in the area of cost sharing. And some of these things, that it will help you to reduce your embodied carbon in that project. Yes, it might cost you more, but it's a good thing looking at it. I'm not advocating for it to be all carbon, and then your cost becomes something skyrockets. But up to a reasonable extent, if you can chip away more, like one of the things that we did was, it was about 0.5% of the contract. We said, okay, it would help, to offset that for you to achieve that carbon range, the standard target that we have given. So those are kind of things I expect project sponsors to do with their contractors, because that would help to reduce the amount of carbon. And another thing is industrial collaboration as well. It's not only just that company, because one of the things that HSC is doing is to look at industrial collaborations. Who else is doing these big projects around? Do we have the same customer, the same contractor? How can we work with that customer to reduce contractor to reduce the amount of costs on their side? Like one of them is the JCB. Is okay. How can we help to invest into their innovation to give us the kind of plans that we need that is more sustainable to use on those? So that's not what a particular organization would bear. It would need, what we're doing is collaborating with other big users of those products to say, okay, hey, can we work with this manufacturer to actually produce that kind of machines that would help us, and then innovate the entire industry, and not just for our own project, but the projects to come. So those are kind of collaborations that needs to be happening now. It's not really an individual organization, but a collaborative approach within an industry could help reduce those carbon in their plants, in other things that they can use, within that sector. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, many thanks, Emmanuel. And in the sort of in the short time remaining, I want to, Emmanuel, as you were talking just now, and there's I guess there are two things that come to mind. One is that a lot of what we've been talking about in terms of active transport, whether or including things like long distance trains, it's really a city-centric discussion. And whilst most of us do live in cities, some of us don't. So the question, I guess, to you, and maybe a minute each before we go, is there a role for cities, between national governments and us as individuals? Is there a role of cities to accelerate this? And in particular, thinking of local planning authorities. So if you say to someone, our construction will be, like you were saying, Natalie, our construction will be net zero or carbon neutral. So we deal with the embodied carbon head on, and the operational carbon. Is that something that could help us move a little bit faster within our sandwich constraints?
I think it has to be. I think when we're talking about projects now, and I know that the Major Projects Association, for example, is looking at the same thing, is, it comes back to that collaboration. We need to be learning from each other, working together, and sort of sharing consistent messages around what we're doing to reduce carbon that's built into projects. Because as you mentioned, we're in Wales, for example, a lot of the area that we're going to be working in will be rural, and we'll have to consider things like on-demand transport, buses and things that people can phone up, the car clubs and all sorts of other things that integrate that transport further. But I think it's been consistent message here all throughout the conversation is that, we need to collaborate, and that'll move us forward faster.
Great, thanks very much. Are there any other comments on that? The role of cities and local planning authorities, Craig?
So I think there's a role for cities in particular, because they do have, or local authorities, because they do have a lot of a hold over what can actually happen at that local level. But thinking about the wider element of carbon, the majority of us look at carbon of what we're actually responsible for. And I think that's one of the stage changes that can help with collaboration. Stop thinking about carbon as that's my carbon, that's your carbon. Scope 1, 2, and 3 is potentially the best and the worst part of carbon management. And that's why what I'm trying to look at is you have your scope 1, 2, and 3, but that is your emissions. That is the emissions that you manage. And then you have your scope of influence. What can I do to influence my partners, my contractors, the local authorities to make the changes that they need to? Why aren't we looking at carbon at the procurement phase, set a baseline? What was a previous infrastructure project? How much carbon did we use in that? And then say, well, there's the baseline. Go and beat it. Challenge our contractors while collaborating with them. But I think the more that we can influence carbon reduction, the better we can actually make everything going forward. And I think that's where we fall down the most, is we understand what we need to do, and we are very insular in the way that we think, okay, that's me looked after our emissions. But what about your supply chain? You're never going to take those emissions on board as your emissions. No one, I think it's very seldom as scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, people do take on a lot of the supply chain, but you can influence them. And I think that's the collaborative approach that needs to be taken.
Agreed. And I think when we think of, if we looked, as you say, Craig, if we cast our eyes a little bit more broadly, almost imagine that you could then actually design better outcomes, which might provide, evidence to business cases that allow the solutions, or at least the solutions in principle, to be adopted more broadly. Whether you're, in looking at, conventional transport appraisal, like, Jameel, you were discussing, or if you're looking at, cities and or countries that, aren't necessarily completely aligned with Paris. If you can show how it works and it works well, then everybody likes a good case study, and they can take from it the things that they can translate easily into their own setting. I want to thank you all very much for joining us this afternoon. We're 1 minute off, and yes, look out for the clean transport paper due to be published during the COP. And yes, many thanks and all the best.
Thank you.
Thank you.